Okay, Don Quixote. Yes, it's Don Quixote, right?
I always heard of Don Quixote.
I always heard
Don Quixote. Okay, let's say just like in Spanish. I googled and it was Don Quixote. But if you prefer to say Don Quixote, I'm gonna say it like that because it's even easier for me. So the first volume of Don Quixote came in 2 volumes. The first one was published in 1605, and that was a great success, a great commercial success, which, by the way, didn't free Cervantes from his debts and his financial problems. So he always lived in financial scarcity. But nonetheless, it was a great success and it sold very well. But it also had its detractors and its animosities, and many people were, especially scholars and intellectuals, were contrary to Don Quixote, regarding it as an inferior and a low-level novel, as a pointless novel, as a novel with no argument, as a poorly written novel, and so on. And one of those great intellectuals that were highly regarded in those times was López de Vega himself. So Cervantes greatly admired López de Vega, and Cervantes wanted to be a poet, wanted to be a playwright, and he didn't succeed. That's why he held López de Vega in such a great esteem, because López de Vega was a great renowned poet and a great playwright. And he said that he would gladly see all of the copies of Don Quixote burned in the Plaza Mayor in Madrid, in exchange for the success of a single play written by López de Vega. So that admiration and that esteem that Cervantes had for López de Vega didn't prevent López de Vega from being very harsh and even aggressive against Don Quixote. I repeat, the first volume of Don Quixote was published in 1605, and in 1614 a second, let's call it a sequel to Don Quixote came out. But it was not written by Cervantes. It was written by Avellaneda. And who's that Avellaneda? Most likely, it's almost taken as a fact that it is a pen name. So it was not the actual name. And some have even suggested that it was López de Vega himself who wrote the Quixote by Avellaneda to distort the plot and to actually steal the character of Cervantes. Other scholars that are a little more balanced say, well, maybe it's not likely López de Vega himself was Avellaneda, but it's likely that López de Vega was behind whoever wrote that sequel to Don Quixote. So Cervantes had to hurry up and come up with a sequel, the actual sequel, the one that we now regard as the complete Don Quixote, that encompasses the first and the second volume. So now, if you get a Don Quixote, you're going to find the first and the second part, and each one with something like 50, 60 chapters, right? So he had to hurry up to print that second part that came out in 1616, the same year Cervantes died. How does Don Quixote, what is the end? Don Quixote dies. I'm not a spoiler. Don Quixote dies. So, why? Why did Cervantes kill Don Quixote?
so no one can.
Exactly, to prevent anyone from writing any sequel. He didn't want apocryphal sequels following his Don Quixote. Maybe that could be one of the answers of why do all the characters in Hamlet die. So you see, I'm not derailing from your question. You had asked me about Hamlet. Maybe that could be one of the reasons why the characters in Hamlet die. Okay, but let me continue now speaking about Cervantes, unless there are any other questions about the Spanish Golden Century. Yes, the Spanish Golden Century.
No,
Shakespeare?
Shakespeare.
Yes.
Well, Mr. Maxim gave us a very good personal point of view about the play, but I have some questions. You can just give us like the context of Shakespeare, of Shakespeare like world and most of the consequences, because I mean I know he's extremely famous, but I'm not like very, I don't know like exactly like how Shakespeare gave like this for the English language, the I don't know like all the consequences that he had.
Yes. To begin with, Shakespeare in his time was not regarded as a great poet or as a great playwright. He was regarded as a great businessman. He would be something like Steven Spielberg nowadays. So he was a great producer. The quality of his work was not highly regarded. Actually, it was underestimated, especially by scholars, because Shakespeare apparently had little or no education. He could hardly write, to the point that in all the signatures that have survived to our days, he always misspells his name. His own name, he didn't know how to spell it. Right? So sometimes he writes Shakespeare with an X. Yes. And this has bewildered people so much, to the point that some have suggested that it was not Shakespeare himself who wrote the plays, and they have suggested many other people. And maybe the most grounded, although it can also be discarded, but the most grounded theory is that it was the Lord of Oxford who wrote these plays, but in those times to be a playwright was regarded as a low ranking work, so he didn't want to stoop himself to present this work as himself, so he got this actor, William Shakespeare, to sign those works and present them as they were his own. Grounding for this, well, law, for example, all the legal processes that you find in Shakespeare's works are legally accurate with the law of that time. So if he was just an actor, how did he know so much about law? Most likely he had lived in Italy, because many of his plays are staged in Italy and he knows Italy quite well. So again, if he was just an actor, how could he know Italy so well? Most likely he knew French, and he knew many other things that are usually not common for an actor. In those times, an actor could read and memorize his lines, and that was pretty much it. And Shakespeare himself was an actor. For example, in Hamlet, I don't know if you knew, but he played the ghost of Hamlet's father. Yes. In addition, not all the works of Shakespeare survived, or at least they were not handed over to posterity the way they came from Shakespeare's pen. So many of those plays had to be reconstructed from the actors themselves, who had to memorize their lines. So those eventually the play was lost. So they said, "Oh yeah, I remember you played Juliet. So can you please remind us what you said?" And many of those works had to be reconstructed in that way. Nonetheless, most people claim that Shakespeare actually wrote his own work, and the arguments from obscurity, the arguments that deny the authorship of Shakespeare's works just because there's an empty space, because there's a void, because we don't know what happened during the dark years of Shakespeare. Those are insufficient arguments, because in those times, there was no record of practically anyone who was not a nobleman. Shakespeare was not a nobleman, so there were hardly any records of him. So his education is something that has remained obscured to many, and I think it will remain obscure. But in his time, he was underestimated, and he was also even mocked. He was even mocked for trying to stand up above his rank. You should stay where you are because you should stay where you belong, and you have no education like we do. For example, that's what Christopher Marlowe said about him. Yes, Christopher Marlowe had education, and this I think could be said of Robert Greene, who disregarded Shakespeare's work precisely because he had no formation. But the point is that in Shakespeare we find a very talented businessman. The fact that he started a theater, he could either rent space to present his works or start a theater, the Globe. And that is what he did. He started his own theater because he was a very talented businessman. There was a plague, think pretty much of the COVID pandemic. Nobody could go to the theater. What does he do? It is in that year when he publishes his books of poetry. Yes. So in his time, he was regarded as a very talented businessman, as a very talented entertainer within the business of entertaining. But he was not regarded as a great figure, as a great literary figure. Okay, Milton was regarded as the great English poet for a long time. John Milton, and it was only way into the 1800s that Shakespeare became more and more appreciated. And at least in our days, I don't think any figure can rival with Shakespeare. Yes. You can say that Dickens has a better narrative than Shakespeare. Okay, go ahead, say that, but don't say that Dickens is superior to Shakespeare. You can say that Melville has more introspection than Shakespeare. Go ahead, say that, and acknowledge the depth that Melville has towards Shakespeare. Yes, and envisioning Shakespeare's work as a whole, no one in English literature can rival. Well, a few can rival, but no one can surpass Shakespeare, at least in the way he's regarded now. Dickens definitely has created a lot of English characters, but he's second to Shakespeare. No one has created more English characters than Shakespeare. I mean, iconic characters, characters that endure, characters that have a personality in the end. And if you compare the characters that Dickens created and you compare them with the characters that Shakespeare created, you realize that the characters of Dickens are caricatures. They are like one-sided personalities, right? Scrooge, he's always Scrooge. Yes, of course, in the end he turns, but he's always Scrooge, and he's very predictable because you know he's Scrooge. With Shakespeare, it's no way like that. Yes, and it catches my attention how scholars start arguing, well, what were the motivations behind King Claudius? Did he murder the king because he wanted the throne? Or did he murder the king because he wanted the queen? And they start arguing. And I say to myself, well, it's a play, right? It's a play. So it's a fictional character. Why are you taking it so seriously? Well, because Shakespeare penned this character so realistically to the point that then people start arguing about him as if he were a real person, because he has endowed his characters with soul. Right. Ophelia, did she commit suicide, or was that an accident? We don't know. Why? Because in real life there are many things we don't know. So those loose ends, I think they are meant there, and they are intentionally meant to be there. Yes, because the production of Shakespeare is portentous. It's something. I don't think it's difficult to rival with Shakespeare in theater. In theater. Maybe in poetry you can find some poets that will rival with Shakespeare, but when it comes to theater, I think you'll have to go back to Greek theater to find someone that at least can rival with Shakespeare. Yeah. So definitely Shakespeare is a great milestone in not only in English literature but in world literature, and he also contributed greatly to shaping English language as it is. So many of the words that are commonly in use today, we owe them to Shakespeare. I know that to a modern reader, Shakespeare might seem a little obscure, but compare Shakespeare with Chaucer. He's a lot closer to us, even Spencer, right? So English, as we know it, has been powerfully influenced by Shakespeare. I say this by myself. Maybe the only other figure that has influenced English as much as Shakespeare is Ernest Hemingway. And when we get there, I'll explain why. Yes.
Two short questions. I don't know if I wrote the name right. Garcilaso de la Vega?
Garcilaso.
Garcilaso de la Vega. And second question. Was he a priest? Because you kind of mentioned in the video like he considered vocation. I don't remember, but at the end...
Garcilaso de la Vega, I don't think so. No, definitely he was not a priest. He was a soldier. He was a soldier and he died in battle. He died in battle because he got angry at Charles V, who told him that he was not doing well in his campaign, so he got furious. He went out straight to the battle, forgetting his helmet, and he died. So that's the end of Garcilaso de la Vega. Then López de Vega, he was a priest.
Okay.
Calderón de la Barca was a priest. Fray Luis de Góngora y Alrote was also a priest. Fray Luis de León was also a priest. Of course, St. John of the Cross was also a priest. Yeah, so many of them were priests. And unfortunately, not all of them were priests because of their devotion. Many of them were priests rather because they wanted a pension.
Oh.
Yes.
For education.
Pension. Yes. They wanted money. Yes.
When you say that Shakespeare contributed to English language, it's because like he invented like words or like he developed it.
Yes, or at least words that were in common use were crystallized thanks to Shakespeare's penning, thanks to Shakespeare's writing. Okay. Okay, let's go back to Cervantes. Okay, shall we?
Sorry for the rustical question that I really know, but for someone that had never read Cervantes before, why should I read Cervantes?
Yes, I hope this lecture will clarify why should we read Cervantes. So let's begin with that. Why should we read Cervantes? Why should we read Cervantes if in the first edition there were 664 typos? Errors, mistakes, misprints, right? And I say that Cervantes was a great narrator with a horrible narrative. Why do you laugh? Because you understood or because you didn't? Maybe you didn't understand. Let me explain this. What do I mean that Cervantes was a great narrator with a horrible narrative? He's a great narrator because he knows how to narrate actions very vividly, like very few can describe in world literature, right? Think of the fight at the inn. The way Cervantes describes it is so vivid, so colorful, it flows so smoothly that you can be amazed and say, well, he was a great narrator. Or just think of the very, very iconic episode of the windmills. To write how Cervantes charges against the windmills and how he ends up being injured after that. The way he describes it is so colorful that has become an iconic milestone in world literature, right? So he's a great narrator because he knew how to write very well and he knew how to describe actions very well, right? but his narrative is horrible because there's not an articulate line. And there are many things that intersect and that in the end he tries to bring together and he doesn't quite succeed. And there are also loose ends. And for example, at a certain point, Sancho Panza loses his donkey, Rusio, and then in an ensuing chapter, he's riding his donkey, and it's never clarified what happened and how he got his donkey back. Or and in the second part, he clarifies that, and he criticizes the wise man who wrote the first half of Don Quixote. So it is Don Quixote speaking, and says, whoever wrote that volume about my life didn't know my life well enough. Okay, and he tries to patch things and explain what happened with Donkey. Or, for example, some others have criticized that Sancho Panza gets 100 coins, escudos in Spanish, right? He gets 100 coins. So what? What happens after that? We never know. Okay, so in the second part, a scholar, Sansón Carrasco, asks Sancho Panza, what did you do with the 100 coins that you got? And he says, well, it's up to me to decide what I can do with my own money, right? So he was filling in for those gaps. Cervantes had a very, very poor narrative line, but he's a great narrator. However, what is the value of Don Quixote? The value of Don Quixote, in my own understanding, is that maybe no one understood the human person as Cervantes did. You can say that Dante has better structure, and of course, anyone has a better structure than Cervantes. You can say that Virgil has more lyricism than Cervantes, and of course, it's easy to have more lyricism than Cervantes. You can say that Shakespeare is more reflective, right? You can say that Victor Hugo has a better narrative line. You can say that Melville is more enticing, and so on. So there are many great literary figures that surpass Cervantes in many regards. But when it comes to the understanding of the human person, I doubt anybody got to understand the human person as deeply as Cervantes did. What do I mean with this? Let me begin with a broader question. What is a classic? What is a classic? What makes a work a classic? Yes?
Something that doesn't lose its values throughout the time.
Something that doesn't lose its value throughout time. So, something that can... I think that's a good definition because it brings together two things. Time in our own lifespan and time throughout the ages. Let's just broaden this a little more and say something that can communicate to different and various cultures. So Cervantes is, I think, second only to the Bible, the most translated work in the entire literature. I don't know if Harry Potter has surpassed Cervantes. I'm not sure. So maybe my metrics are a little off. But anyway, it has been very widely translated. So a great classical work can communicate to a lot of people in different cultures and in different times. And in its time, it was regarded as a great comedy. And maybe nothing more in the 1600s. But in the 1700s, during the Illumination and these high ideals, they regarded Cervantes as a great work of illumination because it is the knight who fights for noble and lofty ideals. So during the all through the 1700s, Cervantes was read as a great work that embodied that idealism to fight for lofty ideals, right? desfacer entuertos, to undo wrongs. That was the ideal of Don Quixote, and that was the way Don Quixote was read throughout the 1700s. During the 1800s, that is during Romanticism, maybe we have some kind of disillusionment and some disenchantment because we see the horrors that illumination had brought after the French Revolution. So Don Quixote was read as a lamentation. So that ideal fight and that struggle and that noble intent to bring good to society has failed. And now society mocks Don Quixote. So is this a work that highlights the greatness of a nobleman like Don Quixote who dedicates his life to fighting for a noble cause? Or is this work a criticism of society that disregards, despises, mocks, and ultimately quenches that lofty ideal? It depends on the way you look at it. It can also be read from a perspective, let's say during the 20th century, of relativism. So, what is truth? Is it the windmills or is it the giants? Right. Is it an inn or is it a castle? So Don Quixote has been able to communicate with a wide range of people throughout many different through the course of centuries, and he's also been able to communicate with people in various circumstances, in various cultures. Furthermore, another definition of a classic is it's a work that you read once and you get something out of it. You read it twice and you get even more. When you only find an enticing plot, okay, yes, it can be interesting to read it and see how it unfolds. But once you get to an end, maybe you enjoyed it, but that's pretty much it. You read it again and you already know how it's gonna go, right? And that's the problem of spoilers, right? If they tell you the end and they spoil it for you, maybe there was not much in it. But if you can read it once and then you read it once again and you know where it's gonna go, but nonetheless the journey itself is pleasurable and it's enriching, maybe there's something greater. You read it a second time and you get more out of it. Why? Because the work has changed? No, because you have changed. And not only do you read it a second time, you read it after 10, after 20 years. You read it again and you see how it speaks to you in a different way. Why? Because the work has changed? No, the work remains the same, but you have accumulated new experiences and now it's speaking to you in a new way. It's speaking to you in a new way. I'm not going to finish speaking about this because this is very broad, but let me just mention these two highlights, and we'll continue speaking about them in our next session. Do you have a next session? On Thursday? Yes. This coming Thursday we're going to speak about it, okay? Another thing that has been great and marvelous for me in my understanding of Don Quixote is his understanding of our worldview. We all have our worldview. We see the world in a particular way. We all do. And Don Quixote has a worldview. And in a comedy, you see that worldview that Don Quixote has, and you can make fun of it. But if we are honest, we resemble Don Quixote way too much. One of my favorite lines was in chapter 4. Arremeteré confiado en la razón que de mi parte tengo. I will charge, trusting in reason, which is on my side. Whoever doesn't think reason is on his side? Lenin? Martin Luther? The angry taxi driver that yells at you in the traffic jam? They all charge thinking they have reason on their side. And so do we. So, the first time I read Don Quixote, I was fascinated by this. I will charge, trusting reason, which is on my side. Of course, reason is on my side. And I have to fight for great ideals against communists and against Masons and against the whole world because reason is on my side. After almost 2 decades, when I got back to Don Quixote and I read it again, I almost laughed at myself. Because I saw that worldview of Don Quixote that resembles so much all of us. We have that worldview. And when we charge, don't we hurt ourselves so many times charging against windmills? Because we have that worldview. And we charge trusting in reason, which is in our side. But, yeah, sometimes we get hurt. But most of the times we hurt others. Like the friars like the Benedictine friars. According to Don Quixote's worldview, they were wrongdoers, they were evil people. So he charges against them because it's according to his worldview they are bad people. So he has to charge them and he hurts them. And they were just Benedictine friars. I think it's chapter 8 or 9. That's one thing, and I'm gonna expand on it in this coming Thursday, okay? The other thing, I'm speaking about the worldview, the way we envision that which surrounds us, the way we envision ourselves. Are we just as ridiculous as Don Quixote can be? Don Quixote has an idea about himself, and we all have an idea about ourselves. And nobody can change Don Quixote's mind when he's speaking about himself. How difficult it is to change your minds when I'm speaking to you. And when we talk to people, when we communicate to people, we have to know that most people are very much like Don Quixote. Don Quixote had an idea about himself. And everything and anything just confirmed him in that idea. Even when he realizes that things were not the way he wanted them to be, he comes up with some crafty device to avail his own worldview and the vision he had about himself. When he charges when he attacks a herd of sheep, thinking that was an army. Okay? So after he realizes he had charged against a herd of sheep, he says it was an evil wizard that turned the armies into sheep to deprive me from the glory I was going to gain. We always have very good excuses. The idea we have about ourselves, we can defend it against anyone and against any argument because we are very fixed in our own ideas about ourselves. So we are very much like Don Quixote. And I finish with this. I think it's in chapter 4 of the second part. Chapter 4 of the second part, this scholar I mentioned, Sansón Carrasco, mentions the first part of Don Quixote and what he had read about him. And then he says, it's almost like the confession of Peter. So, who do people say I am? Don Quixote asks to Sansón Carrasco. And he starts saying, well, they think that you are raving lunatic, they think that you don't know, you are out of your wits, they think that you you are pathetic, they think that so and so, and they think that you don't know how to dress well. What is Don Quixote's response? But I dress well. That particular point where there was a discrepancy, he clings to that to discard everything that they had said about himself. When anybody criticizes you, and they come with a list of 10 things, the thing that doesn't match, that's what you hold on to. So, I know I haven't finished this, and I'll continue explaining this, but why should we read Don Quixote? Because it reveals us a lot. It speaks very eloquently about the human